The wedding day of Grace Miller nearly turned into a public joke. Relatives whispered, old friends smirked, and even her own mother looked away because nobody could understand why a smart, beautiful woman was marrying a poor single father named Wyatt Carter, a man who drove a rusted-out pickup truck, spent his days repairing broken farm equipment. The mockery peaked when one cousin said out loud, in front of half the guests, that Grace was throwing her entire life into the mud. But only hours after the ceremony ended, an engine roared from the sky, and a private jet came down onto the field behind the church, turning everything anyone thought they knew completely upside down. If you enjoy stories where the people who mocked someone are finally forced into silence, stay until the very end. The town of Millbrook Falls sat quietly at the edge of the Montana plains, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business before breakfast was finished, and where a person's worth was measured by the truck they drove and the house they lived in. Grace had grown up there, the daughter of a respected schoolteacher and a retired county clerk, and she had always been the girl other families pointed to when they wanted an example of ambition done right. She had graduated near the top of her class, built a steady career managing accounts for a regional agricultural supply company, and turned down more than one wealthy suitor, because something about their confidence always felt hollow. Her parents had long imagined a different kind of wedding for her, one with a groom in a tailored suit who owned land, or ran a business, or at the very least drove something newer than a decade old. When she brought Wyatt home for the first time, the disappointment on her mother's face was impossible to hide, though nobody said it directly, not yet. Wyatt lived a few miles outside of town in a house that had clearly seen better decades, its paint peeling along the porch, railing, its roof patched more than once with mismatched shingles. He drove an old red pickup with a dent in the tailgate and a check engine light that never seemed to turn off, and he seemed to have a talent for fixing almost anything from tractors to water pumps to the ancient furnace in the Millbrook Falls Community Center. People in town called him reliable, even kind, but never impressive, and certainly never wealthy. He rarely spoke about his past, and when neighbors asked, he simply said he had raised a child alone for a while, though the child, a boy, now attending a boarding school overseas, was almost never mentioned, and never appeared in any of the stories people told about him. That single detail, a father with a son somewhere far away, only added to the sense that Wyatt was a man carrying more history than he let on. As the wedding date approached, the whispers grew louder and less kind. Old classmates who once envied Grace's easy confidence now seemed almost pleased to see her, as they assumed settling for less than she deserved. Distant relatives placed private bets on how long the marriage would last, some giving it 6 months, others generously offering a year, as if predicting failure were a form of entertainment. Grace heard fragments of these conversations at family dinners and community gatherings. Comments about wasted potential, about a woman who could have done so much better, about a man who apparently had nothing to offer beyond a strong back and a toolbox. She never let the comments show on her face, but they settled somewhere deep quietly, the way unwelcome opinions often do. Grace's father, a quiet man named Robert, who rarely voiced strong opinions, finally pulled her aside one evening on the porch and asked gently but pointedly whether she had truly considered what a lifetime of financial struggle might look like. He mentioned bills, unexpected emergencies, and the kind of stress that could quietly erode even the strongest relationship over the years. Grace listened patiently, understanding that his concern came from love rather than judgment. Yet something in her stayed firm, a quiet certainty she could not fully explain even to herself. She told him that Wyatt made her feel steady, in a way none of her previous relationships ever had, that his calmness felt like solid ground, rather than emptiness. Robert nodded slowly, unconvinced but unwilling to push further, and the conversation ended the way most difficult conversations in that family did, with silence and a change of subject. Later that night, Grace lay awake replaying her father's words, not because they had shaken her resolve, but because she recognized in them the same fear every parent carries, the quiet worry that love alone might not be enough to protect the people they cherish most. Through it all, Wyatt remained unshaken. He never raised his voice in his own defense, never tried to correct the assumptions swirling around him, and never once seemed embarrassed by the old truck or the peeling paint on his porch. He simply smiled, the same calm, almost knowing smile, whenever someone made a pointed remark about his circumstances. Grace found this strange at first, then oddly reassuring, as though his peace was rooted in something she could not yet see. There was one detail though that she noticed more than once and never quite understood. His phone rang constantly with calls from unfamiliar numbers, some bearing international codes she did not recognize, and every single time Wyatt would glance at the screen, silence the call without a word, and slip the phone back into his pocket as if nothing had happened at all. The weeks following the engagement gave Grace a strange growing sense that something about Wyatt did not add up. It began with small things, the kind most people would never think twice about, but which lingered in her mind long after each conversation ended. One evening, while helping a mutual friend understand a complicated loan agreement, Wyatt casually explained the mechanics of international currency exchange with a fluency that no small-town mechanic should have possessed. Another time, discussing a news segment about airline regulations, he broke down the layers of federal aviation law with the ease of someone who had studied it for years, not skimmed it once in a magazine. Grace began paying closer attention after that. She noticed how Wyatt occasionally referenced conversations with people whose names sounded vaguely familiar from business news, mentioning them the way one might mention an old coworker without any apparent awareness that most mechanics in rural Montana did not casually know state senators or hedge fund managers. When she asked him directly how he knew so much about finance and aviation, he offered only a brief, almost dismissive answer, saying that he had done a few different things earlier in his life before settling down. He never elaborated, and something in his tone told her not to push further, at least not yet. There were physical clues too small and easy to overlook individually but strange when considered together. The watch he wore every day, scratched and unremarkable at first glance, turned out on closer inspection to be a limited production model that collectors quietly paid enormous sums to acquire. Grace only recognized it because she had once helped a client research luxury watch investments for an insurance policy, and the moment she noticed the same subtle detailing on Wyatt's wrist, her stomach tightened with a question she could not quite voice. The international phone calls continued, arriving at odd hours, sometimes late at night, sometimes just after dawn. On 2 separate occasions, a well-dressed stranger with a faint accent showed up in town asking quiet questions about where he might find a man named Wyatt, only to leave abruptly once he located him, the two of them disappearing for brief, hushed conversation behind the hardware store. Grace never overheard what was said, but she watched the exchange from across the street, and she noticed that the stranger addressed Wyatt with a level of formality that felt entirely out of place for a man who spent his days replacing tractor belts. One rainy afternoon, while cleaning out an old closet in Wyatt's house to make room for her own belongings, Grace came across a small metal box tucked beneath a stack of folded blankets, its surface worn smooth from years' handling. Inside, she found a handful of old photographs showing Wyatt in a sharply tailored suit, standing beside unfamiliar men in front of what looked like a corporate headquarters, along with a faded newspaper clipping too creased to read clearly. She did not open the clipping fully, some instinct telling her the discovery belonged to a part of his life he was not yet ready to share, and she quietly returned the box to its place beneath the blankets. That evening she said nothing about what she had found, though the image of Wyatt in that tailored suit lingered in her mind long after the house had gone dark and silent around her. By the time the wedding invitations went out, Grace's curiosity had hardened into something closer to quiet suspicion, though she kept her doubts to herself, unwilling to unravel something she did not yet understand. If Grace's doubts were quiet, her cousin Jessica's disapproval was anything but. From the moment she learned of the engagement, Jessica made it her personal mission to remind everyone within earshot that Grace was making the biggest mistake of her life. She dropped comments at every family gathering, comparing Wyatt unfavorably to the polished young executives she followed on business news channels, and suggesting not so subtly that Grace was essentially adopting a grown man who could not support himself. Jessica had built her own identity around appearances, married to a mid-level manager at a regional bank, and she seemed almost personally offended that her cousin would settle for someone so far beneath the standard she believed family deserved. Determined to expose what she saw as an obvious mistake before it was too late, Jessica organized a family dinner just weeks before the wedding, framing it publicly as a warm gesture to welcome Wyatt into the family. In truth, her intentions were far less generous. She invited nearly every relative who had ever voiced skepticism about the marriage, seating Wyatt at the center of the table, like a defendant awaiting judgment, and began peppering him with questions clearly designed to humiliate rather than to understand. She asked him directly what his annual income looked like, tilting her head with exaggerated curiosity, then followed with questions about whether he owned his home outright or was still paying off a mortgage he could barely manage. She asked whether he held any stocks, any retirement accounts, any life insurance policies substantial enough to protect Grace if something happened to him, phrasing each question as though she already knew the humiliating answer and simply wanted everyone else to hear it out loud. She even asked with a thin smile stretched across her face whether he had ever considered furthering his education or learning a trade with more reliable income, as though repairing machinery for a living were some temporary phase rather than a life he had chosen deliberately. An uncle at the far end of the table chuckled quietly at the remark, and a younger cousin nudged her sister, both of them clearly enjoying the show Jessica had arranged under the guise of hospitality. Wyatt answered every question calmly, in short, unbothered sentences, offering no details, no defense, and no visible frustration, which only seemed to irritate Jessica further. She had expected him to stammer, to grow defensive, to reveal some anxious insecurity beneath the surface, but instead, he simply finished his meal, thanked her for the dinner, and asked if anyone wanted more bread. His composure, rather than winning her sympathy, deepened her contempt, and she left that evening more convinced than ever that Grace was making an irreversible error, unaware that her cousin's fiancé understood far more about wealth and status than anyone at that table could imagine. After the guests had gone home and the dishes had been cleared, Grace found Wyatt sitting alone on the porch, staring out at the dark fields beyond the yard. His expression calm, but distant, in a way she had not seen before. She apologized quietly for Jessica's behavior, embarrassed on behalf of her family, but Wyatt only shook his head and told her there was nothing to apologize for, that people often revealed the most about themselves in moments meant to expose someone else. He said that judgment, when it came from insecurity, rarely landed the way its owner intended, and that he had long ago stopped measuring his worth by whatever a room full of strangers assumed about him. Grace sat beside him in the cool evening air, and for the first time since the engagement began, she felt less like she was defending her choice, and more like she was simply beginning to understand the depth of the man she had chosen. What almost nobody in Millbrook Falls knew, and what Wyatt had spent years carefully keeping buried, was that a decade earlier, he had been one of the most closely watched entrepreneurs in the private aviation industry. In his late 20s, working out of a cramped office with 2 business partners and very little sleep, Wyatt had built a technology platform that revolutionized how private aircraft were scheduled, tracked, and maintained across dozens of countries, a system that major charter companies and corporate fleets eventually depended on daily. Within a few short years, his company had grown from a scrappy startup into an industry standard, and when a much larger aerospace conglomerate offered to acquire it outright, Wyatt sold his controlling stake for a sum that made him almost overnight a billionaire before he had even turned 35. For a while he lived the life the world expected of someone in his position, attending industry conferences, sitting on corporate boards, appearing occasionally in business publications as a rising figure in aviation technology. He married young to a woman named Claire, who shared his early ambitions, and together they raised a son, while Wyatt continued expanding his influence across several related industries, from aircraft maintenance to private airfield management. Then, without warning, everything he had built lost its meaning in a single afternoon, when Claire was killed in a car accident on an icy road just outside their home, leaving Wyatt alone with a young son and a fortune that suddenly felt unbearably hollow. In the months that followed, Wyatt made a decision that stunned nearly everyone who knew him. He stepped back from the daily operations of his companies, transferred much of his authority to trusted executives, and quietly began selling off portions of his more visible holdings, though he never fully let go of the businesses that had made him wealthy in the first place. He wanted distance from the world that had surrounded him during his wife's death, distance from cameras' headlines, and people who valued him only for what he could offer them. Eventually, he moved to a quiet corner of Montana, under his own name, but without any of the trappings that typically followed a man of his resources, choosing instead a modest house, an old truck, and work that used his hands rather than his bank accounts. His son grew older and eventually enrolled in a respected boarding school overseas, a decision Wyatt made carefully to give the boy stability and privacy far from any attention his father's history might attract. Nobody in Millbrook Falls ever thought to ask why a small-town mechanic might have a son studying abroad because nobody imagined there was anything to ask about at all. Wyatt preferred it that way, choosing silence over explanation, and ordinary days over the kind of recognition that had once cost him more than any success was worth. The executives who remained loyal to him throughout those years understood the arrangement, completely running the daily operations of his companies, with minimal interference, reporting to him only when decisions required his direct approval. They respected his need for distance, having watched him grieve in the months following Claire's death, and they took quiet pride in protecting the privacy he had fought so hard to reclaim. Occasionally, one of them would fly out to meet him in person, choosing small, unremarkable diners near Millbrook Falls, rather than drawing attention with anything more visible, and Wyatt always insisted on paying for the meal himself, a small habit that amused the older members of his team who remembered the very different life he used to lead. Word never spread beyond that inner circle, partly because loyalty ran deep among the people who worked closest to him, and partly because Wyatt had structured his companies in a way that kept his name largely absent from public filings, press coverage. Reporters who once tried tracking his whereabouts after the sale of his company eventually gave up, assuming he had simply retreated from public life entirely, which in its own way was not far from the truth. He had traded recognition for peace, and for years that trade had felt like the only decision he had ever made that truly belonged to him alone. By the time the wedding finally arrived, Jessica had one final plan to make sure the entire town understood exactly what kind of man Grace was marrying. She approached the reception coordinator weeks earlier and arranged for a short slideshow to play during the toasts, presenting it as a light-hearted tribute to the happy couple, when in truth she had curated every image with a very different purpose in mind. She dug up old photographs of Wyatt's weathered house, his dented pickup truck, and one particularly unflattering picture of him, crouched beneath a tractor covered in grease sweat, soaking through his shirt. When the moment arrived and the lights dimmed for the slideshow, laughter rippled through the reception hall almost immediately, guests exchanging amused glances as each new image appeared on the screen. Someone near the back of the room said loudly enough for half the tables to hear that they were looking at the poorest groom Millbrook Falls had ever produced, and the comment drew a fresh wave of chuckling from people who should have known better. Grace felt her face burn with humiliation, gripping the edge of the table as she watched her wedding, the day she had imagined for years, dissolve into something closer to a public roast at her new husband's expense. Wyatt, however, sat perfectly still beside her, his expression unreadable, showing no trace of embarrassment or anger, as image after image flashed across the screen. When the slideshow finally ended and the lights came back up, he simply reached for his water glass, took a slow sip, and glanced briefly at the thin silver watch on his wrist, the same one Grace had once quietly recognized as far more valuable than it appeared. Leaning toward her, he said quietly that they might be arriving soon, a comment so calm and so strange that Grace had no idea what he could possibly mean. Before she could ask him to explain, a low, distant rumble began to build somewhere beyond the church, faint at first, then steadily growing louder, rattling the windows, just enough for people to notice and fall silent. Mid-conversation, Jessica, still standing near the projector with a satisfied smile fading slowly from her face, turned toward the sound, along with everyone else, unaware that the very spectacle she had orchestrated to embarrass Wyatt was about to be overshadowed entirely by something far beyond her control. The murmurs in the room shifted from mockery to confusion. Within seconds, guests glancing at one another, searching for someone who might explain what was happening, though nobody had an answer. Even the reception coordinator, normally unshaken by any wedding mishap, stepped outside to see what could possibly be causing such a disturbance so close to a quiet country church. The sound outside grew impossible to ignore, a deep mechanical roar rolling across the open Montana sky, and one by one guests abandoned their seats and drifted toward the windows, then out through the reception hall doors entirely. Grace followed the crowd, her heart pounding with a mixture of confusion and dread, uncertain whether something terrible was happening, or whether this was simply another strange twist in an already strange day. What she saw stopped her completely in her tracks. A sleek white aircraft descending gracefully over the open field just behind the small church, its engines slowing as landing gear extended toward the grass below. Whispers rippled through the crowd almost instantly, guests speculating that some wealthy stranger had likely rented the field for an unrelated purpose, or that a confused pilot had simply picked the wrong landing site by mistake. Nobody imagined, not even for a moment, that the aircraft had anything to do with the modest wedding taking place a few hundred yards away, least of all, a connection to the groom everyone had spent the entire reception mocking. The jet came to a smooth stop, its engines winding down, and a set of stairs unfolded from its side, as the entire crowd stood frozen watching in collective disbelief. A man in a crisp uniform stepped down, first moving with brisk, practiced efficiency, scanning the gathered crowd until his eyes landed directly on Wyatt. He walked straight toward him, ignoring everyone else entirely, and addressed him with a level of formality that made several nearby guests visibly flinch. He said clearly enough for half the crowd to hear that the board members had all arrived and were simply waiting for his signal, referring to Wyatt not by his first name, but by a title that suggested authority far beyond anything Millbrook Falls had ever associated with him. A stunned silence swept through the reception, broken only by the soft hum of the jet's engines finishing their shutdown sequence. Moments later, 3 black luxury vehicles rolled up the dirt road leading toward the church, their tires kicking up dust as they came to a stop near the field. More than a dozen men and women in tailored business attire emerged, moving with the confident, unhurried pace of people accustomed to importance, each of them approaching Wyatt with the same unmistakable respect the pilot had shown moments earlier. Every single one of them addressed him the same way, calling him Mr. Carter with a deference that made Jessica's earlier mockery feel suddenly unbearably foolish, and the crowd that had laughed so easily during the slideshow now stood in complete uncomfortable silence, struggling to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the one standing calmly in front of a private jet. One of the executives, a sharply dressed woman who introduced herself as the head of the company's finance division, stepped forward and briefly explained for the benefit of the stunned crowd that an urgent matter involving a major acquisition required Wyatt's signature before the end of the week, and that the board had agreed it was easier to bring the meeting to him rather than interrupt his wedding entirely. She spoke with the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to high-pressure decisions, and though her words were meant practically, they landed on the crowd like a second wave of shock, confirming that everything unfolding in front of them was real, not some elaborate misunderstanding. Grace stood frozen among the crowd, watching executive after executive step forward to greet her new husband with a familiarity and respect she had never witnessed directed toward him before. She turned to look at his face, searching for some explanation, and found only that same calm expression he always wore, though now it carried the quiet weight of a secret finally coming into the light. When the crowd's initial shock settled just enough for conversation to resume, Wyatt gently took her hand and asked if she would walk with him for a moment, away from the noise, so he could finally tell her the truth she had been circling for months without realizing it. He explained plainly, and without exaggeration, that he still held controlling interests in the very industry he had once built. From nothing, an aviation technology firm that had grown into an international network spanning private jet, scheduling systems, aircraft maintenance operations, and a chain of regional airfields scattered across several states. Beyond that, he maintained a private investment fund that quietly financed emerging companies in renewable energy and logistics, a fund he managed personally through a small, trusted team who understood his need for discretion above all else. His net worth, though he rarely thought about the number itself, comfortably exceeded several $1 billion, a fact that had remained almost entirely invisible to the residents of Millbrook Falls for the better part of a decade. He told Grace that none of this had ever been a secret out of shame, but rather a deliberate choice, a decision made in the aftermath of his wife's death, when the weight of his fortune had started to feel more like a burden than a blessing. He never wore his wealth openly, never spoke of it unless directly necessary, and structured his business dealings so that the executives who worked closely with him understood the importance of his privacy in this small corner of the world. The people around him in town had simply seen what he allowed them to see. A quiet, hard-working man who fixed machines and kept mostly to himself, never suspecting that the same hands repairing a broken tractor engine also signed off on decisions affecting thousands of employees across several countries. Grace absorbed the revelation slowly, piece by piece, feeling less betrayed than she expected, and more like a puzzle she had been quietly assembling for months had finally clicked into place. Nearby, still standing frozen near the reception hall entrance, Jessica watched the exchange between executives and Wyatt, with a rising sense of panic, replaying every dismissive comment and humiliating question she had thrown at him over the past several weeks. suddenly aware of exactly how badly she had misjudged the man she had worked so hard to embarrass. Grace's mother, who had spent months quietly hoping her daughter would reconsider the engagement, now stood at the edge of the crowd with tears welling in her eyes, though this time they carried no trace of disappointment. She approached Wyatt slowly, almost hesitantly, and told him she owed him an apology for ever doubting the kind of man he was, admitting that she had judged him by the same shallow measures the rest of the town had used. Wyatt accepted her words graciously, without a hint of resentment, telling her that most people judged what they could see, and that he had never expected anything different from strangers who only knew the surface of his life. It was a small moment easy to overlook amid the chaos of the afternoon, but it meant more to Grace than almost anything else that happened that day. News of what happened at the church spread through Millbrook Falls faster than anyone could have predicted, and within days the same people who had once mocked Wyatt's old truck and peeling porch began finding reasons to speak to him directly. Former classmates who had barely acknowledged Grace at the grocery store suddenly wanted to reconnect, sending warm messages about how happy they were for her, as though months of quiet condescension had simply never happened. Distant relatives who had placed private bets on the marriage's failure now called to offer congratulations, their voices carrying an unmistakable eagerness that had nothing to do with genuine goodwill. Some approached more directly, hoping Wyatt might consider investing in struggling local businesses or offering personal loans to cover debts that had quietly piled up over the years. A cousin who ran a small equipment rental company showed up unannounced one afternoon, with a folder full of financial projections, hoping to pitch an expansion plan he had clearly assembled overnight. Even the pastor who had married them stopped by under the pretense of a friendly visit, mentioning almost casually that the church roof had needed repair for years and that any contribution, however large or small, would be deeply appreciated by the congregation. Wyatt listened politely to each of these requests, occasionally offering modest practical help where he felt it was warranted, but he remained wary of anyone whose sudden warmth seemed to arrive only after the jet had landed. Others simply wanted introductions, hoping a connection to Wyatt might open doors to opportunities they had never previously considered within their reach. Jessica, perhaps unsurprisingly, proved the most persistent of all. Within 2 weeks of the wedding, she reached out to Grace directly, her tone noticeably softer than it had ever been, asking whether Wyatt might be willing to help her find a position at one of his companies, or at the very least offer a recommendation that might open doors within the finance industry she had always dreamed of entering. Grace listened politely, though something in her had grown noticeably less patient with her cousin's sudden change of heart. When Wyatt learned of the request, he responded with the same calm, measured tone he used for nearly everything, telling Grace clearly that he held no personal grudge against Jessica or anyone else who had doubted him, but that he also had no intention of rewarding arrogance simply because circumstances had changed. He said it plainly, without bitterness, explaining that respect earned after the fact meant little when it had been withheld so easily before, and that he preferred surrounding himself with people who valued character over convenience, not people who only discovered his worth once a jet had landed in a field. That single statement, quiet and unhurried, as it was spread through the family almost as quickly as the news of the private jet, had becoming something people repeated to each other in hushed, thoughtful tones for months afterward. Even so, Wyatt did not turn his back entirely on those who had once mocked him. When an elderly neighbor who had joined in the laughter during the slideshow later fell behind on medical bills after a difficult surgery, Wyatt quietly arranged for the debt to be covered without ever mentioning it directly, asking only that his involvement remain unknown. When a former classmate who had spread unkind rumors about Grace lost his job at the local feed store, Wyatt made a call to a logistics company he partly owned and secured the man an interview, offering no explanation beyond a simple recommendation. He never sought credit for these quiet acts of generosity, and most of the people he helped never learned where the assistance had truly come from, which was in many ways exactly how he preferred it. In the weeks following the wedding, once the shock had settled and the crowds of curious relatives had thinned, Grace finally found the moment to ask Wyatt the question that had been sitting quietly at the back of her mind since the day that he had landed. She asked him directly why he had never told her the truth earlier, why he had allowed her to endure months of pitying looks and dismissive comments from people who assumed she had settled for far less than she deserved. She wanted to understand what could possibly justify letting the woman he loved walk into a wedding surrounded by ridicule, when a single sentence from him could have silenced every doubter in the room. Wyatt considered the question carefully before answering, choosing his words the way he seemed to choose everything deliberately and without excess. He told her that if he had revealed his fortune from the very beginning, every interaction that followed would have been shaped by it, whether he wanted that or not. People would have treated him differently, spoken to him differently, and perhaps even loved him differently, no longer responding to the man standing in front of them, but to the number attached to his name. He wanted more than anything to know who genuinely cared about him as a person stripped of every external advantage before allowing money to complicate that understanding. He explained that after losing Claire, he had watched wealth transform people around him in ways he found deeply unsettling, watched friendships bend under the weight of expectation, and watched respect become something transactional rather than earned. He never wanted his son to grow up surrounded by people who valued him only for his last name, and he certainly never wanted a marriage built on assumptions about what his fortune could provide rather than what he as a man could offer. Living simply had never been about hiding shame, but about protecting something far more fragile, the ability to know without doubt who stood beside him because of who he truly was. Grace understood perhaps more deeply than she expected to, and something in her chest loosened as the last pieces of confusion finally settled into place. She realized that every quiet moment of dignity Wyatt had shown throughout their courtship, every calm response to cruelty, every patient explanation offered without defensiveness, had been rooted in this same quiet philosophy. He had never needed anyone's approval, because he had already proven to himself, long before Millbrook Falls ever knew his name, exactly what kind of man he wanted to be. Grace also came to understand something about herself through the experience, realizing how easily even she had begun questioning her own judgment, simply because everyone around her doubted the decision she had already made with a clear heart. She remembered nights lying awake, wondering whether her family might be right. After all, whether love alone was enough to sustain a marriage that looked from the outside so mismatched and so improbable. And she remembered how those doubts had quietly worn at her confidence, even as she refused to let them show. She thought back to the months of quiet ridicule, the pitying looks from relatives, the whispered conversations at family gatherings, and recognized how close she had come to allowing outside opinions to overshadow what she had known, instinctively from the very beginning. It was a humbling realization, one that reshaped how she approached judgment going forward, teaching her to trust the evidence of character over the noise of assumption. A lesson she carried with her, long after the shock of the wedding day had faded. A year passed quietly after the wedding, and despite everything the town now knew about Wyatt's fortune, remarkably little about his daily life actually changed. He and Grace continued living in the same modest house on the edge of town, its porch finally repainted, though only because Wyatt insisted on doing the work himself over a quiet weekend, rather than hiring someone else to handle it. The old red pickup remained parked in the driveway dent in the tailgate, and all still Wyatt's preferred vehicle for driving into town or hauling equipment out to a neighbor's struggling farm. He never moved them into one of the sprawling estates his wealth could easily have afforded, and he never once suggested that their simple life needed upgrading now that the truth was out. Instead, he continued repairing tractors and water pumps for neighbors who could not otherwise afford proper mechanics, often refusing payment altogether, or quietly covering costs for families going through hard times without ever mentioning it publicly. He contributed generously to the local school system and the county's aging community center, though he insisted the donations remain anonymous, unwilling to let generosity become another form of performance. When the school's aging bus fleet finally broke down beyond repair one winter, an anonymous donation covered the cost of 2 replacement vehicles within a matter of weeks, and though several teachers speculated about the source, nobody ever traced it back to the quiet mechanic living on the edge of town. From time to time, the same sleek white jet would return, landing in that same open field behind the church, and Wyatt would disappear for a few days to attend board meetings or oversee major decisions within his companies. He always returned exactly as he left, dressed in worn work clothes, climbing back into his old truck as though the private jet and the tailored executives belonged to some entirely separate life that simply happened to intersect with his own from time to time. Grace, for her part, never grew tired of watching the 2 versions of her husband move so easily between one world and the other, never once seeming out of place in either. She sometimes teased him about it, asking how a man capable of overseeing billion-dollar decisions could still spend an entire Saturday morning wrestling with a stubborn irrigation pump, and Wyatt would simply shrug and say that fixing a broken pump made just as much sense to him as approving a merger, since both, in their own way, involved solving a problem someone needed solved. It was this steadiness more than the wealth itself that Grace had come to treasure most, the sense that no boardroom and no bank account would ever change the fundamental shape of the man she had married. Jessica, for her part, had changed more than almost anyone expected. She no longer made pointed remarks at family gatherings, no longer compared Wyatt to polished executives on television, and whenever their paths crossed in town, she offered a quiet, genuine nod of respect rather than the dismissive glances of the past. It was not the money that had changed her, not really, but the slow, humbling realization that she had spent months mocking a man whose character had never once wavered, regardless of what anyone believed about him. In the end, the people of Millbrook Falls came to understand something about Wyatt Carter that no slideshow, no old photograph, and no rusted pickup truck could ever fully capture. His greatest wealth had never been measured in aircraft or investment portfolios, but in a quiet, unshakable sense of who he was, a value that never once required anyone else's recognition to remain true. Do not judge a person by the truck they drive or the house they live in, because there are those who wear old clothes while carrying an entire empire quietly behind them, and there are others who wear polish and confidence while owning nothing beneath the surface but pride. True worth is always revealed through character and action, not through whatever a stranger happens to notice during a first impression.